Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We always try to tackle some pretty meaty topics here. And today we're diving into the deep end of equality of educational opportunity. Now, I bet you're already thinking, yeah, everyone deserves a fair shot at a good education, right? It kind of seems obvious. But here's the thing. What exactly does that mean? What does equal actually look like in the real world? And how do we even get there? That's what we're going to unpack today.
That's the crux of it. And I'll tell you, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy really helped us go deep on this one. It's amazing how such a simple sounding idea, this idea of equal educational opportunity, can get so incredibly complicated so quickly. And believe me, it's way more controversial than you might think.
It really is, because on the surface, like you said, it seems so straightforward. Kids shouldn't have their futures decided by things totally outside their control, right? Their family's income or their race or their gender, we all kind of get that on a gut level.
Yeah. And think about it, education itself is just such a huge factor in shaping someone's life. Their job, their income, their health even, their ability to participate in democracy, being an informed citizen, even just their overall well-being and happiness. Education really does touch everything.
No doubt about it. So let's take a step back before we jump in. Why is this even its own separate issue? Why are we talking about equality of educational opportunity specifically? Why not just lump it in with the equality of opportunity in general?
I think that's a great question to start with because education has this really unique place in society, unlike anything else. It has this incredible value both for the individual, right, and for society as a whole. Think about what the Supreme Court said back in Brown v. Board of Education. Education is pretty much essential if you want to navigate modern life, and they were absolutely right.
I mean, that was decades ago, but it still rings true today, doesn't it?
Totally. And when you think about it from an individual's point of view, education opens up all these doors, not just to a better job or more money, though that's certainly part of it, but also to being more autonomous, being able to make better decisions for yourself, to being healthier, to being a more capable person all around. And that's not even touching on the satisfaction and joy that can come from just learning new things, from expanding your horizons. It's a good in and of itself, a part of living a good life.
Right. It's not just about getting ahead. It's about becoming a more fully developed human being.
Exactly. And then you've got society's perspective, which is just as important because we need people with skills and knowledge to keep the economy going, to innovate, to solve problems. And we need citizens who are informed and engaged to participate in a democracy. Without those things, society starts to break down. And there's a pretty undeniable link between education levels and civic engagement. People who are more educated are more likely to vote, to be politically aware, to be active in their communities.
So the stakes are pretty high, right?
No question about it. And here's the catch. High-quality education, it's not some unlimited resource. There's only so much to go around. This is something Amy Gutman talks about. Even in wealthy countries, we're always having to make choices about how to spend our money. Do we invest more in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure? It's a constant balancing act.
Makes sense. We have limited resources, so we got to prioritize.
Right. And that scarcity plays out in all sorts of ways. Look at what happens with college admissions, especially those super competitive schools. The Varsity Blues scandal a few years back, remember that? It really showed how far some wealthy families are willing to go to get their kids into those top-tier universities. It's a pretty extreme example, but it shows how intense the competition can be and how without those kinds of resources are at a serious disadvantage.
Yeah, it's a good illustration of how uneven the playing field can be.
Absolutely. But the bigger issue, the more widespread issue, is what happens even before college in primary and secondary schools. Despite the fact that we legally ended segregated schools with Brown v. Board, our schools are still largely separated along racial and socioeconomic lines. And that's because of housing patterns, because of where people live. And there's tons of research showing that this kind of segregation has a major impact on student outcomes. Students from low-income backgrounds, minority students, they're way more likely to end up in schools with fewer resources, with less experienced teachers, with more challenges overall.
It's almost like their educational opportunities are determined by their zip code.
In a lot of ways, yeah. And to make matters worse, the pandemic really exposed and amplified these existing inequalities. Think about all those school closures, the shift to online learning. It hit kids from low-income families way harder. They were less likely to have reliable internet access, less likely to have a quiet place to study, less likely to have the support they needed. And this gap just widened even further. Sean Reardon, he's done some fascinating work on school segregation, and he's shown how deeply this affects achievement gaps.
So even though separate but equal was struck down by the Supreme Court decades ago, we're still grappling with the consequences of segregation, aren't we?
We are, yeah. It's one of those things that's so deeply ingrained in our society that it's really hard to disentangle.
So we've talked about the value of education, the scarcity of high-quality opportunities, the effects of segregation. Is there anything else that makes equality of educational opportunities such a distinct and important concern?
Yeah, there's one more crucial piece to this whole puzzle: the role of the government. Pretty much everywhere you look, in every developed country, education is largely provided and regulated by the state. It's not just some private matter. And this is where things get really interesting from a justice perspective. Because if the state is the one providing education, if it's the one setting the rules, then it has a real obligation to make sure everyone has a fair shot, right?
Absolutely. With great power comes great responsibility, as they say.
Exactly. Justice demands that governments treat all their citizens with equal concern and respect. So when it comes to education, the state can't just discriminate based on things like race or gender. That's just basic fairness. But what's fascinating is that even indirect actions by the state can create inequalities in education. Things like how we fund schools.
Oh, yeah, the whole property tax thing.
Right. In the U.S., local property taxes play a huge role in school funding. So what happens? Schools in wealthier neighborhoods, they get way more money per student than schools in poorer neighborhoods. And that creates these huge disparities in resources, in facilities, in teacher quality, in pretty much every aspect of the educational experience. And it sends a powerful message to kids, a message that can be really damaging to their sense of self-worth.
It's like saying your education, your future, it's only as valuable as the property values in your neighborhood.
It can feel that way, yeah. Jonathan Kozol, he's done a lot of work on this. He calls it a dignitary injury. It's the feeling that you're not valued by society, that you're not worthy of the same opportunities as others. Rawls had a similar idea. He talked about the social basis of self-respect. The idea is that having real opportunities to develop your talents and abilities to succeed in life, it's not just about material benefits. It's about your sense of dignity, your feeling that you have a place in society, that you matter.
So it's about more than just money. It's about the message it sends.
Right on. So to sum this up, the value of education, the scarcity of opportunities, the role of the government, all these things make equality of educational opportunity its own unique and incredibly important problem to tackle. And it's not just a theoretical problem either.
No, definitely not. It plays out in real ways in the lives of real people, especially here in the U.S.
Exactly. It's baked into the very fabric of our society. So maybe this is a good time to take a quick look back, a little history lesson on how this concept of equality of educational opportunity has actually unfolded here in the U.S.
Yeah, because it's not like it just appeared out of thin air one day.
Not at all. As we mentioned earlier, there was that landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board, back in 1954. It declared that state-provided education, which is what we're mostly talking about here, has to be available to everyone on equal terms. It was a huge step forward, at least in theory. But the reality on the ground, well, it's been a lot more complicated.
We're still dealing with the legacy of segregation, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. Even though Brown v. Board was a legal victory, it didn't magically eliminate racial segregation in schools. De facto segregation, segregation that happens not because of laws, but because of housing patterns, socioeconomic factors, all those things. It's persisted. In fact, some argue that it's even gotten worse in some ways. Mm-hmm. And it's increasingly intertwined with class-based segregation. This is something that Reardon and Bischoff have done some great work on. They've shown how the lines between race and class are blurring when it comes to educational opportunity.
So it's not just about race anymore. It's about the intersection of race and class.
Right. Black students are much more likely to attend high-poverty schools, and that means they're less likely to have access to the same resources, the same quality of teaching, the same opportunities as kids in more affluent schools. It's a vicious cycle that's really hard to break.
It sounds like we've taken one step forward and two steps back.
It can feel that way sometimes. And to make things even tougher, there have been other legal decisions that have made it harder to address this problem. I'm thinking of Milliken v. Bradley in 1974. That case really limited the ability to use busing to integrate schools across different districts.
So even if you wanted to bus kids from a high-poverty district to a more affluent one, the law made that much harder to do.
Exactly. And it's especially problematic because many individual school districts just don't have enough racial diversity within them to make a real difference. And then you have parents involved in 2006. That decision basically limited the use of race in school assignment plans, which a lot of people saw as a huge step backwards.
So instead of tackling de facto segregation head on, we're kind of tiptoeing around it.
In a lot of ways, yeah. And this brings us back to something we touched on earlier, school funding. How we fund our schools in the U.S. has a huge impact on equality of educational opportunity. Because, it's mostly tied to local property taxes, right?
Right. Wealthier neighborhoods, higher property values, more money for their schools. Poorer neighborhoods, the opposite.
Exactly. And that creates a system where a child's educational resources are often determined by where they happen to live, which is completely arbitrary. It's like a lottery based on your zip code. And it disproportionately affects low-income Americans, especially those from minority groups.
It's pretty wild when you think about it. A kid's future can be shaped by something as random as their address.
And it's not just a matter of opinion or perception. It's backed up by research. There's this landmark case, San Antonio v. Rodriguez, back in 1973, where the Supreme Court ruled that there's no federal constitutional right to education. They also decided that these funding inequalities based on property taxes, they're okay. It's wild, especially when you compare it to other countries like Finland, where they have a much more centralized funding system that tries to level the playing field.
It makes you wonder, what does equal opportunity even mean if the resources are so dramatically different depending on where you live?
It's a really fundamental question, right? And it's one that sparked a lot of debate and legal challenges, mostly at the state level, because with the federal courts pretty much saying this is how it is, a lot of the action has moved to state courts. And there, the big debate is about whether school funding should focus on equality or adequacy.
So equality meaning everyone gets the same amount of resources, and adequacy meaning everyone gets enough to meet a certain standard.
That's the gist of it. And each state has its own constitution and its own set of laws governing education, so it's a bit of a patchwork across the country. But the adequacy approach, it's gained a lot of traction in state courts. The idea is that you have to at least ensure a certain minimum level of educational resources for all students, even if that means some districts get more than others.
Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here. We've talked about the value of education, the challenges of segregation, the role of the government, the legal battles over funding. It seems like we're finally ready to tackle the really big question here. What does equality of educational opportunity actually mean? And what are the different philosophical perspectives on how to achieve it?
Absolutely. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty, and it's where things get even more complex. Because philosophers, they've been grappling with this question for centuries. And there's no easy answer. There are so many different interpretations of what equal opportunity even means in the context of education. And then there's the question of how to actually put these ideas into practice, which is a whole other can of worms.
Right, because it's one thing to say everyone deserves a fair chance, but it's another thing entirely to figure out what that looks like in the real world.
Totally. So let's start with the big picture. Philosophers generally agree that there are at least two fundamental questions we have to wrestle with when we're talking about equality of educational opportunity. The first is about the purpose of education itself. Education, it does so many different things. It prepares us for the workforce. It prepares us for citizenship. It helps us develop as individuals. It helps us live more fulfilling lives. So the question is there a single best way to distribute educational resources given all these different purposes? Or do we need to think about different goals of education in different ways?
That's a great point. It's almost like we're expecting education to be a magic bullet that solves all of society's problems.
Right. It's a lot to ask. Like, think about the skills and knowledge you need to be successful in the job market. Those are often different from the skills and knowledge you need to be an informed and engaged citizen, right? And then there's the whole idea of personal growth and fulfillment, which is even harder to pin down. So how do we balance all these different things when we're trying to figure out what equal opportunity means?
It sounds almost impossible.
Yeah, it's really tricky. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that some aspects of education are what we call positional goods.
Positional goods, what's that?
It means your success depends on how you rank compared to others. Like in a race, only one person can be first. So, for example, if you're trying to get into a very selective college or land a highly competitive job, your success depends not just on how well you do, but on how well you do compared to everyone else.
It's a zero-sum game.
In some ways, yeah. But other aspects of education, they're not positional. Like if you learn to appreciate art or music, that enjoyment, it doesn't diminish just because other people also enjoy art and music, right? So the benefits of education can be both positional and non-positional, which makes it really hard to figure out how to distribute them fairly.
It sounds like a philosophical puzzle.
It really is. And then you've got the second big question, which is how we even interpret the phrase equal opportunity. Does it mean that people with similar natural talents should end up with roughly the same level of education? Does it mean we should spend the same amount of money on each student, regardless of their needs? Or does it mean we should focus on giving everyone the same chance to develop their potential, however that's defined?
So many different ways to slice it.
I know, right? And depending on which interpretation you choose, you end up with very different ideas about what equality of educational opportunity means in practice and how to achieve it. And this is where different philosophical approaches come in.
Okay, let's dig into those different approaches. Where do we even start?
Well, one place to start is with the idea of formal equality of educational opportunity. This is sort of the most basic level. It's about eliminating explicit barriers based on things like race, gender, religion, socioeconomic background, all those things that people shouldn't be discriminated against for.
So it's like saying the rules of the game have to be the same for everyone.
Exactly. It's like an anti-discrimination principle applied to education. And Brown v. Board, that was a huge step towards achieving formal equality, at least in the legal sense. But the thing is, formal equality, it's really just the bare minimum. It doesn't address a lot of the deeper, more systemic issues that create inequality in education.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it doesn't say anything about how resources are actually distributed. Like, you can have a formally equal system where every kid can technically go to any school, but if some schools are way better funded than others because of things like property taxes, then you're still going to have massive inequality. And formal equality also doesn't deal with informal barriers like cultural biases, societal expectations, or even just plain old prejudice.
So even if you eliminate the rules that explicitly discriminate, there might still be all these other factors that create an uneven playing field.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about de facto segregation, which we talked about earlier. You can have formally equal admission policies, but if neighborhoods are segregated by race and class, schools are going to stay segregated too. And that has a huge impact on educational opportunities. So formal equality is important, but it's not enough on its own.
Okay, so what's the next step up? If formal equality isn't enough, what else do we need to consider?
Well, another approach that's often talked about is meritocratic equality of educational opportunity. This one takes things a step further and says that educational opportunities should be given out based on merit. On your skills, your talents, your achievements, your hard work.
It sounds fair on the surface.
Right.
The best and brightest should get the most opportunities, right?
That's the idea. And a purely meritocratic system would try to eliminate any advantages based on things like family connections or wealth. It's all about what you earn, what you deserve based on your abilities. But even this approach has some pretty serious problems when you look closer.
Like what? What's wrong with rewarding merit?
Well, one big problem is that merit itself, it's not something that just exists in a vacuum. It's shaped by all sorts of factors, including the educational opportunities you've already had, like kids who've had access to good schools, good teachers, enrichment programs, all that stuff. They're going to be more likely to develop the skills and knowledge that are valued in a meritocratic system, right?
So it kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. The kids who already have advantages are the ones who are most likely to succeed in a system that supposedly rewards merit.
Exactly. And this is especially problematic when you consider how much family background influences a child's early educational experiences. If your parents have the resources to send you to a fancy preschool, to hire tutors, to take you to museums and all that, you're going to have a huge head start. And then when you get to school, you're going to be more likely to do well, to get good grades, to score high on tests. So even if everyone is technically competing on a level playing field in terms of access to education, the starting line is still way different for kids from different backgrounds.
It's like those kids are already running a marathon when others are still tying their shoelaces.
It's a perfect analogy. And this was something that the philosopher Bernard Williams talked about a lot. He argued that the very opportunities to develop merit are unequally distributed. It's not a fair race if some people are starting miles ahead of others. And there's another big problem with meritocracy, which is defining merit itself.
What do you mean? Isn't it pretty obvious what merit means?
Well, not really. It depends on what you value. Do you define merit purely in terms of cognitive abilities, like how well you do on standardized tests? What about things like creativity, perseverance, leadership skills, empathy, social intelligence, all those things that are harder to measure? And how do you weigh those different qualities?
I see what you mean. It gets pretty subjective.
Yeah. And it gets even more tricky when you're talking about very young kids, because at that age, their potential is still developing. They're like sponges, soaking up everything around them. And their performance on tests or in school, it's not always a good indicator of their underlying abilities or their long-term potential. And this was a big concern for Michael Walzer. He used the example of a reading teacher to illustrate this point. A reading teacher, their job is to teach all kids to read, right? Not just the ones who seem like they're naturally gifted.
So it's about giving everyone a chance to develop their potential, not just rewarding those who already seem to have it.
Exactly. But a strictly meritocratic system, it might lead to a situation where we focus too much on rewarding the kids who are already ahead, and we neglect the kids who might just need a little extra support or a different approach to blossom.
It sounds like meritocracy, while appealing in theory, might actually exacerbate existing inequalities if we're not careful.
Yeah. It's a really powerful idea, but it has to be implemented thoughtfully and with a lot of awareness of the ways in which social and economic factors can distort the idea of merit itself.
So formal equality is too basic. Meritocracy is too flawed, at least on its own. What other options are there?
Well, this is where we get to John Rawls and his really influential idea of fair equality of educational opportunity.
Rawls. He's kind of a big deal in political philosophy, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. He wrote this super important book called A Theory of Justice. It's considered one of the most influential works of political philosophy in the 20th century. And in that book, he lays out this concept of fair equality of opportunity, or FEO for short.
So what's FEO all about?
Rawls argues that for fair equality of opportunity to exist, you need two things. First, social positions, and that includes things like jobs, but also educational opportunities they have to be formally open to everyone. So no discrimination based on race, gender, social class, all that stuff. But then, and this is the key part, Rawls adds the second condition, which is that people with similar talents and motivation, they should have roughly equal chances of achieving those positions, regardless of their social background.
So it's about leveling the playing field in a more substantial way than just eliminating formal discrimination.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even if you remove the explicit barriers, people from different backgrounds are still going to start out with different advantages and disadvantages. So FEO is about trying to neutralize those background differences as much as possible, to give everyone a genuinely fair shot.
Okay, so let's say you have two kids with the same natural abilities, the same drive to succeed. FEO would say that they should have the same chance of getting into a good college, regardless of whether their parents are rich or poor.
That's the idea. It's about making sure that social circumstances don't determine your educational destiny.
It sounds really ambitious.
Yeah.
And I bet it sparked a lot of debate.
Oh, yeah, for sure. FEO has been incredibly influential, but it's also been criticized from all sorts of angles. One of the biggest debates is about how much priority we should give to FEO compared to other social goods.
Like what kind of social goods?
Well, things like income equality, healthcare, housing, food security, all those basic needs that are essential for a decent life. Some philosophers argue that those things should come first, that we should focus on making sure everyone has a basic minimum level of well-being before we worry too much about making sure everyone has a fair shot at getting ahead.
Because what's the point of having equal opportunity if you're struggling to survive?
Right. Like if you're hungry and homeless, it doesn't really matter how fair the college admissions process is. Richard Arneson, he's one of the philosophers who's made this argument. He says we should prioritize the well-being of the least advantaged members of society, even if that means we don't achieve perfect FEO.
So it's a trade-off. Equality of opportunity versus basic well-being.
In some ways, yeah. But Rawls, he argues that FEO is actually super important for well-being because it's tied to self-respect. He says that being able to compete for valued positions on fair terms, that gives you a sense of dignity, of self-worth. It tells you that society values your contributions, that you're not just stuck in some predetermined slot based on your social origins.
So for Rawls, FEO is not just about fairness, it's also about human dignity.
Right. And another big criticism of FEO is that it might not be egalitarian enough.
Not egalitarian enough, but isn't the whole point of FEO to make things more equal?
Well, yeah, but some philosophers argue that Rawls focuses too much on individual talent and motivation and not enough on the ways in which social inequalities can shape those very things.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, like imagine a kid who grows up in a really poor neighborhood, goes to underfunded schools, surrounded by violence and poverty. They might have just as much natural talent as a kid who grows up in a wealthy suburb with all the advantages, but their experiences are going to shape how they see the world, how they see their own potential, how much effort they're willing to put in, right? So even if they have the same access to educational opportunities on paper, they're not really starting from the same place.
So it's not enough to just level the playing field. You
Mhm.
have to address the underlying social inequalities that shape people's aspirations and their belief in themselves.
Exactly. And this is a critique that's been made by a lot of philosophers, including Matthew Clayton and Richard Arneson. They argue that Rawls doesn't do enough to address the fact that people's motivations and aspirations are themselves shaped by unequal social conditions. And they say that FEO seems to treat social luck, like being born into poverty, as something that social institutions should try to correct, but it doesn't say as much about addressing natural luck, like being born with fewer talents.
It's an interesting point. Why should we try to level the playing field for social disadvantages, but not for natural ones?
Right. And defenders of Rawls, they've offered all sorts of counter-arguments. Some argue that FEO should be seen as a way to challenge the very stereotypes and biases that create those unequal aspirations. Others say that it's more about enabling people to develop their moral capacities and pursue their own goals, whatever those goals might be. And others say that we might need to add an additional principle to FEO, something that ensures everyone has enough support to develop their self-respect, even if FEO is fully realized.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on. But it sounds like FEO, while aiming for a more just system, still faces some pretty tough questions.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the other philosophical perspectives on equality of educational opportunity?
Yeah, there are a few others that are worth mentioning. One is prioritarianism, which basically says that we should give more weight to improving the well-being of those who are worst off in society. Gina Schouten, she's a philosopher who's written about this. And in the context of education, prioritarianism might lead to some pretty radical conclusions. Like, it might suggest that we shouldn't be spending public money on educating gifted kids unless we can show that it directly benefits the least advantaged members of society.
That's a really interesting, if controversial, idea.
Yeah, it definitely challenges our usual assumptions about who deserves educational resources. Another challenge to FEO is the practical difficulty of actually identifying and measuring natural talent. Like, how do you know for sure what a child's potential is, especially when they're young? And how do you separate out their innate abilities from the effects of their upbringing and their environment? It's not an easy thing to do, and it raises questions about whether FEO can ever be a truly workable standard.
It's like trying to hit a moving target. Kids are constantly growing and changing, so how do you measure their potential at any given moment?
It's a real challenge. And then you have advancements in fields like epigenetics, which show how much our genes can be influenced by our environment. It really blurs the lines between what we consider nature and nurture and makes it even harder to say for sure what's truly natural talent and what's the result of environmental factors.
So maybe it's less about trying to measure natural talent and more about creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to flourish regardless of their background or their genes.
I think that's a really important insight, and it actually leads us to another perspective on equality of educational opportunity, which focuses on what we might call flourishing. This view argues that the ultimate goal of education should be to make sure everyone has an equal chance to live a good life, a flourishing life, where they face only the obstacles that come from their own free choices.
Sounds lovely in theory. But how do you even define a good life or flourishing? That seems pretty subjective.
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges with this view. Because what constitutes a good life, it can vary a lot depending on your culture, your values, your individual beliefs. And in its most extreme forms, this view could suggest that we need to compensate not only for social disadvantages, but also for genetic ones.
Like giving extra resources to kids who are genetically predisposed to certain learning challenges.
Exactly. And that raises all sorts of ethical questions, like what if we start labeling kids based on their genes? What if we start treating them differently based on their supposed potential, even if they haven't actually shown any difficulties? There's a risk of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, of limiting kids' opportunities based on our assumptions about their genes.
That's a slippery slope.
Yeah. And then there's the question of parental rights. Like, how far can the state go in shaping a child's education, especially when it comes to something as personal and value-laden as defining a good life? Rawls, for example, he argued that families should have the freedom to raise their children according to their own values, even if those values aren't perfectly aligned with the state's idea of a good life. So this view of equality of opportunity for flourishing, it's definitely thought-provoking, but it has some serious practical and ethical challenges.
No doubt. It sounds like a noble goal, but figuring out how to achieve it in a way that respects individual rights and avoids unintended consequences, that's a tall order.
Absolutely. Then there's another perspective that focuses specifically on the role of education in preparing people for the job market. This view argues that equality of educational opportunity means making sure everyone has a fair shot at getting a good job, at earning a decent living, at achieving economic security.
So it's about economic justice.
Yeah, because if you think about it, a good education is pretty much essential for getting ahead in today's economy, right? And we know that income inequality is a huge problem in many societies, so making sure everyone has access to the education they need to succeed economically, that's seen as a crucial part of social justice.
Makes sense. But isn't there more to education than just getting a job?
Of course. But this view argues that economic opportunity is so fundamental, so closely tied to things like health, housing, and overall well-being that it deserves special attention. And Leslie Jacobs, she's a philosopher who's written about what she calls stakes fairness. She argues that when the stakes are really high, like when your access to healthcare or your ability to put food on the table depends on your educational attainment, then making sure everyone has a fair chance becomes even more important.
I mean, those are pretty high stakes.
Yeah, no kidding. And even though there's a clear link between education and job prospects, research also shows that things like soft skills, like being able to work in a team, communicate effectively, solve problems creatively, those are also incredibly important for success in the workforce. And while formal schooling definitely helps develop those skills, there's a lot more that goes into it. It's not just about what you learn in the classroom.
It's about the whole package. The skills, the knowledge, the personality traits, the ability to adapt and learn new things.
Right. And vocational education, which is specifically designed to prepare people for certain jobs, it has a bit of a mixed track record when it comes to promoting equality. Historically, it's sometimes reinforced existing social inequalities because it's often tracked kids into specific career paths based on their background or their perceived abilities, which can limit their opportunities.
It's like saying, if you're from a working class family, you're destined to be a blue-collar worker. Expert speaker.